Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Come Let Us Reason Together. This is the virtual classroom of Come Reason Ministries, and I'm happy to join you this evening. My name is Lenny Esposito, and we're going to be continuing on really in our 10-week series dealing with some of the toughest questions that Christians are being engaged with in our culture today. We talked a little bit last week about the Bible versus other faiths. How does Christianity stack up in that area? I hope you were able to join us then. And if you're new, welcome. I would advise you, or at least encourage you, if you haven't yet, to go to the Come Reason website and sign up. Give us your name and your email address so that we can send you information about these classes as they become available. We're allowing the general public to access the classes for a limited time, but then they're going to be kind of reserved for folks who are supporting the ministry. But if you just sign up with your name and your email address, that'll give you more access to all the past classes, as well as I'm going to be putting my notes up there, the PowerPoint slides, things like that. They'll all be wrapped together. So that's an exciting feature that's coming along. We have a great series of classes, like I said, planned in the near future. But tonight, we're going to be dealing with what is definitely a hot topic, as I said, the question of transgenderism. And that's what we're going to be talking about. Oh, hold on one second while I pull things together. We got to make sure that sometimes the window that we want to show is not the one that's worth showing. So it is the, okay. So anyway, if you do want to sign up, please go to comereason.org/dare to defend. And it's just, like I said, simply your name, your email address. And we'd love to just keep in touch with you as well. Okay, going now to our big issue, transgenderism. Why do we want to talk about this? Well, it's a big deal in our culture today, and it's gaining steam. It's definitely growing. By the way, before I get too far, this is an interactive class. There is a YouTube chat function, if you're watching this live via YouTube, where you can type in questions and things like that. There will be a time at the end of the session where I'll answer the questions. Also, if you want to say tweet your questions on comereason.org/tweet, you can do that. And we even have a text number that you'll see. Text your questions to 951-732-8631, and you'll be able to kind of get in touch with us any of those ways. That's what I'm hoping will happen. I'd love to have the questions. I'd love to get you all engaged in this so that it's not just me talking, but that you get the chance to interact as well. That's part of the idea. Okay, so let's start off with this topic. And why is this topic so important? Like I said, it is shaping a lot of our culture today in terms of political understanding. It's really become a hot button issue. There's a lot of kids who are trying to understand who they are. Of course, in your teenage years, you're becoming self-aware. Your self-identity is being coalesced at that point in time, and it's been a big deal. So how should we understand this? How should we understand this from a practical viewpoint, as well as the viewpoint from the church and things like that? And what I'd like to do is I'd like to start off with the tale of two folks who were transgendered. So let's talk about two tales of the transgendered here. The first is Kira Bell, and the other is Walt Heiser. Now, Kira Bell was a young girl growing up in Britain. And notice I've picked for this. I've picked one who's young. I picked one who's old. I've picked one who's from the U.S. I picked one who's from the UK. I picked one who's male, one who's female at birth, and so on. So let's just start with Kira. Kira was 14, was a tomboy most of her life, didn't necessarily like getting dressed up in dresses and stuff to go out, things like that. But she says, at 14, her mom asked her, why are you such a tomboy? What's going on with this? And she asked, do you want to be a boy? Now, Kira said no, but the question started her thinking that she might be what was then called transsexual and today known as transgender. And it began her to investigate things a little bit more. It says that she started to persistently play truant at school as she got older, at 14. She felt like the odd one out. She insisted on wearing trousers while most of her peers were wearing skirts. She rarely had friends of either sex in that regard. When she continually refused to turn up at class, she tells us, as a result of bullying, she was referred to a therapist, and she told him of her thoughts. And she felt like she wanted to be a boy. She says, quote, I felt I was not being listened to at school, and I blamed it on being a girl, she explained. I did not feel respected as a young woman compared with young men. I thought life would be better for me if I changed my sex. Very soon, she was referred to her local doctor, who in turn sent her to the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services near her home. When she was 16, she was referred to Tavistock, which is Britain's most respected child gender identity clinic in London. And she said after 3 one-hour-long appointments, she was prescribed puberty blockers, which delayed the development of signs of puberty like periods and facial hair, things of that nature. She was then prescribed testosterone, which dropped her voice, gave her facial and body hair, and masculinized her facial features. 3 years ago, she had her breasts removed in an operation paid for by Britain's National Health Service. So that was Kira. That's her story so far. Now, if we go back and look at another story, someone who's a little bit older, this is Walt Heyer. And Walt Heyer has a little bit of a different tale to tell. It says that when he was a young boy, his grandmother, he would be dropped off at his grandmother's house, who had a purple dress. And she, from 4 years old, would dress Walt in this purple dress and tell him how beautiful he would have been if he was a girl. I guess the grandmother wanted a granddaughter, not a grandson. And she would, he says, withhold affirmations of me as a boy, but she lavished delighted praise upon me when I dressed as a girl. Her actions planted the idea in me that I was born in the wrong body, he says. He goes on to say, through some traumatic home experiences, he began to see this purple dress as his way of escape, of acceptance and safety. But he went through college. He got a position actually started working for NASA as an aerospace consultant. And at 40, though, after some counseling, he decided that he really was transgender and he wanted to move into that realm. So he started cross-dressing in public at 40 years old and became kind of overt, and started going through all the legal pieces to change your name he changed his name from Walt to Laura. He said that he began drinking, though, because of the trauma, because the sexual abuse and the traumatic emotional abuse that his grandmother, as well as his father and his uncle, had inflicted upon him. He was drinking as well, just trying to deaden the pain that he felt. He says, boy, I'll tell you, adding alcohol to this mix was like putting gasoline on the fire. And he started taking hormones. He got feminizing facial features. A gender psychologist recommended surgery, and Walt fully transitioned to Laura at the age of 42. And that's what we see here. So there you have it. You have Walt transitions to Laura, and you have Kira that transitioned to, what was the name? Quincy, because she liked Quincy Jones. But here's the kicker. The outcomes weren't quite as what we would expect. You see, Both of them have since detransitioned, and their tail doesn't stop after their surgery. Now, it takes a few years, but here's the key. Kira at age 23 says she's more miserable now after her transitioning than ever. She says, initially, quote, I felt very relieved and happy about things, but I think as the years go on, you start to feel less and less enthusiastic or even happy about things. You can continue to dig yourself deeper into this hole, or you can choose to come out of it and have the weight lifted off your shoulders. Kira is now a key witness in a lawsuit against Tavistock and the NHS for diagnosing gender identity disorder too easily. She says, quote, I was allowed to run with this idea that I had, almost like a fantasy, as a teenager. 14, 16, and it had affected me in the long run as an adult. So she questions the idea of a 14-year-old being able to make permanent life-changing decisions all on her own with 3 one-hour counseling sessions. That was all it took for them to assign her the opportunity to take puberty blockers, to then take male testosterone, which gave her the facial hair, changed her voice permanently, things like that, and then actually have breast removal surgery. She says now, quote, I'm very young. I've only just stepped into adulthood, and I have to deal with this kind of burden or radical difference in comparison to others, at least. I should have been challenged on the proposals or the claims that I was making for myself, she said. And I think that would have made a big difference as well if I was just challenged on the things that I was saying. So Kira says the treatment needs to change so that it does not put young people like me on a torturous and unnecessary path that is life-changing. I feel like I've been lied to because it did not make me feel any better. As she struggles to return to life as a woman, she adds with feeling, I don't want any more kids to suffer like me. Similarly, Walt Heyer detransitioned from Laura after 8 years of living as a woman. Now, this is a gentleman who didn't undergo his sexual reassignment surgery until he was 40. So he was pretty well established in his life. But 8 years later, he found that the reprieve provided by surgery and life as a woman was only temporary. He writes, quote, hidden deep underneath the makeup and the female clothing was the little boy carrying the hurts from traumatic childhood events, and he was making himself known. Being a female turned out to be only a cover-up, not a healing. At the 3-year life mark of my life as Laura, my excessive drinking brought me to a new low. At the lowest point, instead of committing suicide, I sought help at an alcohol recovery meeting. My sponsor, a lifeline of support and accountability, mentored me in how to live life free from alcohol. At 8 years, though, with the help of his pastor and a man who sat with Walt and accepted him into his church, even as he was still presenting as Laura, he detransitions and he now runs a ministry helping others who likewise feel trapped. So there's 2 stories, and there's stories that you don't hear a lot about. The idea that people may have regrets in making these permanent decisions and what the consequences, the permanent consequences are of things like transgender hormone replacement or surgery, or even, what other emotional scars there may be in this system. So that's one of the things that we want to tackle in this series, in this session, is to understand what transgenderism is all about. And I think that's the piece that we'll probably want to talk about first, is defining where we are in this process. Because a lot of people don't understand even what I mean when I say transgenderism. There's a lot of wiggle room in that. A lot of people have a lot of different ideas. So, for example, there's a difference between gender and sex in the minds of most people today. Okay? So, sex has always been known, understood, and labeled. As long as human beings have been alive, there has been a word for man and a word for woman. That's just true, right? Human beings are comprised of 2 and only two sexes. This should not be in any way, shape, or form controversial. There are two sexes, both of which are involved in the process of reproducing the species, right? Those two sexes are normally, so you have male and female, and those two sexes normally have in their DNA those flags that define their reproductive role. A male will have, in 23 chromosomes, they will have an XY, and a female will have an XX. And that's what causes the distinction in the biology to allow men to sire children and women to bear children. Now, when I talk about transgenderism, realize that I'm not talking about intersexed individuals. That's a key point. Intersex situations are very rare, and they sometimes get thrown into this debate, but they really don't belong here at all, because almost all intersex conditions, the individual can be biologically determined to be a sex, a male or a female sex. Many of these conditions, like Klinefelter syndrome or triple X or something like that, are the addition of, is due to having an additional chromosome. So like I said, there's XX or XY. Well, you can have an extra X chromosome. So that would be Klinefelter syndrome in a boy, he'd be XXY. Or in a girl, it would be a triple X syndrome. But they still present as male or female. They still are XXXY. They just have this extra X chromosome. These are, again, very rare. We're talking 1 to 500 to 1 to 1,000 maybe. There are other issues. So there's those genetic issues in that way. Other genetic issues like androgen insensitivity syndrome, right? These are males born with XY chromosomes, yet they're insensitive to the testosterone and the sex hormones that are produced both in utero and then sometimes even later. Sometimes they're not. But what happens is you have males who are born with kind of female-looking genitalia or ambiguous genitalia. You're talking about 1 in nearly 100,000 births. This is a very, very rare condition. But again, this is not saying that there's a third sex out there. This is clearly that there's an XY chromosome, and what we're seeing is that it's just not expressed in the biology because their biology is somehow insensitive to the hormones and the biological processes that should occur because of the release of those hormones. And the clearest way that I can talk about this is to think of sex this way. There are two gametes. There's sperm and egg. There are only two gametes. There have always been only two gametes, sperm and egg. So there are only two sexes. Now, either your body properly functions to allow reproduction or it doesn't. Okay, that's a question. Either your body properly functions to allow sight or it doesn't. Or either your body properly functions to allow hearing or doesn't. There's lots of bodily functions that we genetically may go awry, but that doesn't mean that there's different species of us out there or different things like that. Your body either properly functions in its role as via reproduction or it doesn't. But there are only two. It is only sperm and egg. There is no third sex. And so that should be, again, this is very clear biology in this part. And as I said, no human culture has not recognized the fact that there are only two sexes. There is mother and there is father, and that's what we see. However, the idea of gender, as it's applied to human beings now, is actually a very new concept. And it's something that we really need to think about. This gentleman, sexologist John Money, was the first one to coin the term and introduce distinctions between biological sex and gender as a role only in 1955. So Money was the one who drew the line and says there's sex, but then there's gender, and gender is something different than sex. And I'll get into the distinctions a little bit. I had a bit. But let me tell you a little bit about money. He and Alfred Kinsey were two of the leading proponents in the middle of the 20th century, theorizing that the concept of one's sex is fungible and able to be manipulated. In other words, he was one of these guys who believed that all sexual constructs, all gender roles and things like that were foisted upon us as a society, that humans were blank slates, and if you raised a boy as a girl, he'd be a girl. He was one who advocated, he counseled the parents for one of the first sexual reassignment surgeries, because they had twin boys, and one of the two boys, during his circumcision, I guess the doctor botched it so severely and damaged his penis that they said, well, it's better to just change his genitalia to look female and raise him as a girl. And he did that. The results, unfortunately, were tragic. The man who eventually grew up from that boy at puberty had strong desires of being male. He always knew he was male. And of course, money, would do all kinds of crazy things. He'd tell one kid to press his crotch against the other. He forced to tell two kids to strip so they could take pictures of their genitals, all kinds of things like that. It was a bad idea. But realize in all of this that, again, what I'm saying is the whole concept of gender as it applies to human beings, before 1955, that didn't exist at all. And even after 1955, it was just kind of a cult idea in the minds of a couple of people. Money's experiment, if you will, on David wasn't until 1967. And it turned out to be bad. Actually, both brothers committed suicide as a result of this terrible incident that they had. But when we talk about gender, and I say this all the time, gender is actually a word that was referring to linguistics, not to people. So gender is something that French nouns have, right? You either are a le policier, or that's a policeman, or la policiere, which is a policewoman, right? So French nouns, you can either take on a masculine form or a feminine form. This is true of Spanish and Italian, Latin. So there's many languages where you have a masculine and a feminine version of it. We have a little bit of it in English, where you had actor and actress, for example, waiter, waitress, that kind of idea. But in French and the Romance languages, even the definite article, the would be changed based on whether the noun itself is masculine or feminine. So table would be masculine, or pen would be masculine, and something else would be feminine, things like that. And that's how gender was understood in those days. That's not, however, how gender is being used currently. So what do we understand in terms of gender when people talk about gender today? Well, the first thing that we can talk about is norms, cultural expression, expectations, right? So for example, and this is where things get a little bit messy, because a lot of people have confused cultural norms or gender norms with sex. Sex is male and female. Gender norms are masculine and feminine. That's what I mean. The former, male and female, is what we are. The latter is what the culture understands as common to the male or the female human being. So, for example, to be, brave, fighting in battle is a masculine thing to do, right? It's you see more men doing it. To be sensitive and perhaps a little bit more caring would be a more feminine approach. This is the idea of masculinity and femininity, how cultural norms play themselves out, and that's the key piece for it all. Now, in these cultural norms, you really do have a mix of biology. Biology does foster some aspects of masculinity or femininity, softer skin, greater muscle mass for men, for example. Those are biological distinctives that we just see. Long hair, not necessarily, because both sexes can grow long hair. Spatial directional abilities favoring males. We know this to be true objectively. On average, more men tend to have better spatial directional senses. Communication capabilities favor females. For example, they tend to be more vocal and more expressive in their speech. So sometimes these things are objective, but sometimes they're simply relative to the culture in which we live. So, for example, blue is masculine and pink is feminine, right? You hear this all the time. Well, that's actually something that's changed over time. Over 100 years ago, it used to be the opposite, because pink was thought to be more fiery, more bright, more energetic, and it was therefore more male, where blue was supposed to be more soothing, more calming, and it was supposed to be more feminine. Also, you look at things that can be culturally construed completely outside the bounds of current context. For example, UFC fights. I mean, many people would say watching UFC matches is a very manly thing to do, right? Well, there are cultures where men would shirk at that. They would say, absolutely not. This is barbarism. This isn't entertainment. This is something to be shunned. And if you're going to be a true man, a man of character, a man of valor, you would stay away from those kinds of things. We've also seen even emotive relationships have this problem. As an example, the friendship that David shared with Jonathan in the book of Kings, where he loved him. They loved one another. And the Bible goes into a good detail to talk about how David and Jonathan were so close to one another and just fell just passionately for each other as brothers, as friends, as lifelong buddies in that regard. Of course, in today's culture, any kind of expression like that, usually it becomes homoeroticized, and there's all you have to do is go, and I don't recommend this, but there's all this fan fiction of take your favorite buddy pair, be it Steve Rogers and Tony Stark, or the Supernatural guys, or whomever. Pick your favorite television buddy pair. And there's all this stuff online about them being homosexual with one another. It's like, what's that about? Why do we have to even go there? But again, those are simply culturally inflicted aspects of what is masculine or what is feminine. So masculine and feminine can be a mix of biological aspects, cultural aspects, and self-perception. And this is the key to understanding transgender, because self-perception is the biggest way that people start to talk about themselves when they talk about gender and transgender. Self-perception is really a subjective assessment based on whatever the individual understands in himself to be masculine and feminine. Now, I said masculinity and femininity also have a subjective aspect to it. So this is kind of subjective on top of the subjective. And they do hold that masculinity and femininity are not the same as sex. So how do we understand this then? What counts? If gender is our self-perception of whether we're a man or a woman, then what is transgender? How do we understand transgender? Well, I pulled out a quote, I think that captures it very well, from the Human Rights Campaign, and they define transgender as this. Transgenderism, they say, is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or expression, notice that they make a distinction between gender identity and expression, is different from cultural expectations based on the sex they were assigned at birth. Being transgender, then, does not imply any specific sexual orientation. Therefore, transgender people may be identified as straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc. So, a couple of key pieces in this, and again, that's from the the page at the Human Rights Campaign. That's there. So a couple of key pieces that you have to realize in this is, first of all, it is not necessary for a person to go through sexual reassignment surgery to be considered transgender or to consider himself transgender. It's not necessary even that they get hormone treatment or hormone blockers. All that's necessary is that their self-identity, how they understand who they are and how they fit their self-understanding against their own understanding of masculinity and femininity, right? Which is what we're talking about with gender. That, and if those two things don't line up, if they say my self-understanding is I'm masculine, but my biology, my body, my chromosomes say I'm female, then I am considered a transgender person, because transgenderism is tied to transgenders, to one's gender identity, how they perceive themselves. Now, I've thrown the term gender identity out. What do I mean by gender? We've talked about gender roles, masculinity and femininity. What's gender identity? And again, the Human Rights Campaign defines it as one's innermost concept of self as male, female, a blend of both, or neither. How individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves, one's gender identity, can be the same or different from their sex assigned at birth. So there you have it. It's a pretty cut and dry piece. And I think one of the things that we need to do is examine the claims of transgenderism. You know, it's interesting. Christopher Yuan, who wrote the book Holy Sexuality, I think made a pretty astute statement. He says, quote, "Given that sex is objective and gender is subjective, you would think we would value conforming one's subjective ideas to the objective truth. That's what you'd think we would value. Instead, the opposite is true. Our culture now values altering the objective physical reality of our bodies to accommodate the subjective impressions of ourselves." And that's the issue. Now, I've said in the past, ideas have consequences. And this is a big idea, and it has a lot of significant consequences. It's a new idea, as I mentioned. Have we thought it through appropriately? Have we thought it through completely? So let's examine transgenderism's claims. Let's take a look at a couple of questions that I have that I just want to ask in order. So first order that I want to ask is gender identity disorder, is this idea that you can be confused about your gender identity, that what you feel inside doesn't match the package, so to speak. Is that real? And my answer is yes, of course it is real. Absolutely. We just read stories from two people who both experienced a real crisis in their lives, both of whom were trying to figure out who they were. Now, one was younger than the other, to be sure, but both of individuals, and this story can be replicated many times over, both individuals had definitely a crisis of identity, and they placed the locus of that crisis in their understanding of themselves and their gender. And this is why you see the problem, as Christopher Yuan said, well, but gender is subjective. How can that work? Well, that's the issue. The debate isn't whether people are conflicted or despondent. It's how we treat those people with that condition. So yes, gender identity disorder is a real thing, and we need to have compassion on individuals who are suffering from it, because they are really suffering from it. The next question then should be, if gender identity disorder is real, is it psychological, is it biological, or is it both? And this is a key piece, I think, that really needs to be fleshed out, because this is where we understand a little bit better the problem of the advocates for transgenderism. So if transgenderism is psychological, if it's subjective, if it's mind based. If it's your understanding of yourself is in error, perhaps, or your feelings that you're feeling are not necessarily appropriate, well, then it needs to be treated as a psychological condition. If, on the other hand, it's physiological, and there are conditions sometimes that would result in physiological changes, we know that there are in other situations, brain traumas will cause a change in, personality or reaction or something like that. If it's that, then we need to deal with it physically as well, medically as well. So what is this? How do we understand it? Well, the best I can do is to pull a parallel case. And it's fascinating that we're seeing another malady, again, very, very rare, but it's showing up more and more, is a malady called body integrity identity disorder. Body integrity identity disorder. Mostly affects males. There have been some females. Fascinating, and I was doing some research on this, fascinating series of studies. What this is there are individuals who feel that either a limb or sometimes their eyes or something else is foreign to them. They understand that their body works just fine, right? They understand that they were built this way, but they want to amputate a leg, or they want to be blind, or sometimes folks will want to be paralyzed at a certain point. Now, there's a lot of interest in this. There's a lot of curiosity in this because there seems to be some specific points at which these individuals, they say, okay, I want to amputate my left leg, but it's got to be 2 inches right above the knee, or it's got to be right here, or something like that. They're very specific in what parts of their body they feel are foreign to them and they wish to relieve themselves of. And this has been done. There's been a couple of controversial surgeries where doctors have removed the limb, and the patients have said afterwards, yes, I feel better. There's no underlying conditions that they can find. There's nothing wrong with the limb or with the eyes or something like that. Many times people will try to self-mutilate if they can't get doctors to deal with them. But body integrity identity disorder is a real thing. And my point in bringing this up, and I'm not stretching this too far, because even in the literature, the people who are starting to write about body integrity identity disorder are pointing to transsexual and sex reassignment surgery as their case study. So in the literature, they are pointing to sexual reassignment surgery and saying, well, it presents very much like this, so shouldn't we treat it like this? And therefore, isn't it ethical to remove a limb? Isn't it ethical to blind someone? Because that's what they want. Now, I don't know why this would be a driver. I don't know why people would want to do this. There's no psychosexual drive behind this. They've looked into that. It's not sexual in nature. It is, though, significant that people who have undergone amputation are usually cheered on. They're usually considered heroes. People try to encourage them. They tend to get more attention than others. But beyond that, we just don't know what the drivers are. Yet here is my point. I think most of us would recoil in horror if somebody said, okay, I've had 3 one-hour counseling sessions with you. You think your legs are foreign, let's chop them off. I mean, nobody's going to do that, right? That's to think that you would remove otherwise perfectly healthy functioning limbs just because someone says so. Maybe what we need to do is counsel you and find out why that feels foreign to you. Where is that? What's causing that? People with genetic identity disorder don't have any underlying biological markers. Their bodies are healthiest functioning as well. And that's the whole point, is we're doing the same thing. We're removing healthy organs. They're just organs in different locations than the limbs. But we're removing healthy organs. We're stopping healthy processes. Anytime you put a child on puberty blockers, you're saying what nature is doing, what it's supposed to do, how our bodies are supposed to function, we're going to halt that and cause a disruption. Is that medicine or is that something else? When you're stopping healthy natural processes that other people, I mean, think about it. Someone who never approaches puberty, never goes through puberty, the first thing you'd do is you'd go to a doctor and say, how can I get my son or my daughter to begin puberty, because they should have done so by now? And the doctor may prescribe hormones to get them started. And we're taking those hormones away in this instance, and then putting, vast amounts of, say, testosterone in a body with an XY chromosome or an XX chromosome that's not designed for it. So that's a big issue. It's psychological in nature, and we have to treat it like a psychological disease. There are other diseases like this that we see all the time where people have this massive discomfort. Obsessive compulsive disorder. As I read the testimonies of individuals who are transgender, and what they felt like and how uncomfortable they felt in their bodies, it reads very much like an OCD style concept. I'm not saying that it presents exactly the same way, but we, again, would recognize an OCD case as something that needs to be counseled, treated, not something that we would approach with surgery and hormones. It's a big problem. So there's definitely primarily a psychological component in these things. Now, here's the other reason why I say it's psychological. It's getting more popular. And usually in human biological conditions, you don't see this kind of thing. Now, and I don't mean just a little more popular. There is a thing that's called rapid onset gender dysphoria. And this was a study put out just recently in about 2015. And rapid onset gender dysphoria is defined as this, quote, parents describe that the onset of gender dysphoria seemed to occur in the context of belonging to a peer group where one, multiple, or even all of the friends became gender dysphoric and transgender identified during the same time frame. So you have either one individual, normally female, who decides I'm a boy trapped in a girl's body. And now all of a sudden all her friends are saying, yeah, me too. Yeah, me too. Yeah, me too. Parents also report that their children exhibited an increased social media internet use prior to disclosure of a transgender identity. Recently, clinicians have reported that post-puberty presentations of gender dysphoria in natal females, that is, people who are born female, that appear to be rapid in onset is a phenomenon that they are seeing more and more in their clinics. Now, the UK did a study in this. In 2009 and 10, 40 girls in the UK were referred to doctors for gender treatment. Okay, that's 2009. 8 years later, by 2018, the number had soared to 1,806. From 40 to 1,806. That is a massive increase. In the same period, boys grew from 57 to 718. And that's the other key. Before, say, the 21st century, it was primarily boys who presented as with gender identity disorder. Boys were in the majority, girls were in the minority. Even here, 40 girls, 57 boys. Boys were in the majority. And then it flipped by 2017, 1,806 girls and 713 boys. That is so far out of the norm, you can't ascribe it to even awareness of what my actual condition is. It blows all statistics out of the water. It means that there is a psychological idea that's enticing to these kids, especially, again, those in their teenage years who are still forming their identity, who are still understanding who they are, to be labeled transgendered. And we can see this even in our culture today, that we hear, oh, you're so brave at coming out about these things and things like that. And we read it with Walt Heyer's story. He just wanted affirmation. We read it with Kira's story. All she wanted to do was fit in but not wear the dresses. And she was tired of being bullied. She was tired of being picked on. So she's going to try something else to see if maybe that side would solve it for her. Unfortunately, it didn't in either case. And that's, again, what scares me. We are undergoing a massive experiment with our children today in this concept of transgenderism. That's a big deal. And I'm worried, because the last question we need to ask is, what do the treatments do? Now that we're putting all these kids into these transgender systems, how do they come out? Well, let's take a look. It turns out that current treatments are not effective. And what do I mean by not effective? Well, Dr. Paul McHugh, who worked at Johns Hopkins University, he was one of the pioneering sexual reassignment surgery team. Johns Hopkins did the first sexual reassignment surgery in the United States. He was the chief psychiatrist on the team, and he oversaw many of the leading pioneering efforts of transgendered surgery at Johns Hopkins. But unfortunately, McHugh started noticing that when he looked to see what evidential support he could find, both in preoperative patients and postoperative patients, he created a study that revealed two things. Number one, 70 to 80% of children who reported transgender feelings would spontaneously lose those feelings when they were left alone. In other words, the vast majority of patients left to themselves would sooner or later identify with their biological sex. It was the counseling and initial treatments that made these patients to continue to believe they were in the wrong sex. And this is what we see. We see this over and over again, that most transgendered, or most people with gender integration disorder, by 25, it resolves itself. Again, that's teenage years are tough. They're the times that you're formulating who you are. Here's the other thing that he found out. Post-surgery, the patient's mental health issues that he identified did not go away. He said, quote, most surgically treated patients describe themselves as satisfied by the results, but their subsequent psychosocial adjustments were no better than those who did not have surgery. So what does that mean? That means that if you were depressed before surgery, you're depressed after surgery. If you're suicidal before transitioning, you're suicidal after transitioning. And that's a big key, because one of the things that he did was they did longitudinal studies. They took studies on studies and started tracing how these post-operative transsexuals did. And it turns out that the suicides are incredibly high for individuals who have already transitioned. Now remember, the reason you do a procedure is to benefit the life and the health of the patient. That's the key. McHugh notes that a very recent study, 2011, out of Sweden followed 324 patients for a period of up to 30 years after they underwent sexual reassignment surgery. Now, unlike the earlier reports, this study had strong evidence for the efficacy of SRS. McHugh reports, quote, the study revealed that beginning about 10 years after having the surgery, the transgendered began to experience increasing mental difficulties. Most shockingly, their suicide mortality rose almost 20-fold above the comparable non-transgender population, 20 times more likely to commit suicide. This disturbing result has yet no explanation, but probably reflects the growing sense of isolation reported by the aging transgendered after surgery. The high suicide rate certainly challenges the surgery prescription. Exactly. If they're going to commit suicide even after they've had surgery, why do we want to cut off healthy organs when there's no beneficial effect long term? In 2010, the National Center for Transgender Equality produced a survey reporting a staggering 41% of those who are identified as transgendered have attempted to commit suicide. a study of 425 patients were currently in treatment receiving hormone therapies found that the number of deaths in male to female transsexuals was 5 times the number expected due to increased numbers of suicide and death of unknown causes. So again, we are seeing massive suicide and death even for the individuals who haven't necessarily undergone sexual reassignment surgery, but have hormone replacement therapy, things like that. If all you do is dress in women's clothing, then it's kind of easy to flip back. But if you've changed your body, if you've undergone facial reconstruction and the removal of your Adam's apple and things like that, that becomes a big deal. And this is scary to me. Again, this is something that we really need to think through, because all those psychopathies that they're presenting with, those are the real issue. We're treating symptoms, but we're not treating the disease in this surgery. And that's why after 10 years, the whole thing comes back to bite us. It's very much, in my estimation, like what we're seeing now with the opioid epidemic. I mean, and this is something that you can use to talk to your friends. If you're talking about opioids, look, in the 1990s, they were being prescribed because they were the first time, the 90s was the first time that opioids started being prescribed for non-cancer patients, for other forms of pain. And the reason why they did this is they were very effective at mitigating pain. Doctors weren't trying to create drug addicts. That's not what they were trying to help patients. They thought that these opioids wouldn't be addictive. They supposedly were told by pharmaceutical companies and possibly pharmacies, who probably got the same information from the vendors, that these would work well, they would be non-addictive. And that's the way they approached it in the early 90s. But pharmaceutical companies also began to promote the use of opioids in patients, even though there was a lack of data regarding the risk and benefits of those patients. Now think about that. So they said, we think that this will work. We've seen it work pretty well in a couple of short-term cases. Let's go wide scale with this. And that's what they did. And by 1999, 86% of the patients using opioids were using them for non-cancer pain. Now, that's the 90s. We're in 2020. What's happened now? Of course, people are dying by the tens of thousands because of the opioid epidemic. In the early 2000s, doctors stopped prescribing opioids, trying to get their patients off the drug. By that time, many of them were already addicted. They were seeking out heroin on the street. In the 2010s, fentanyl and other synthetic opioids come alongside. And that creates an entirely new wave of individuals who not only get hooked, but also can't break the spell of this. The original intent was not malicious. It was trying to help. But because they used the wrong treatment, they've actually doomed more people to a greater level of suffering than they would have if they would have just left things alone. They didn't have the data. We don't have the data yet either. We don't know what puberty blockers on a large scale will do to individuals because we've just started using them a couple years ago. We are in the 1990s, so to speak, of puberty blockers today when we talk about transgenders. And that's the key. So, how do you, that's the understanding of the problem of transgenderism. What I want to do in wrapping this up, though, is to talk about how you can think through this issue and how you can present it to others as you're engaging with them if this issue comes up. And I think it's important for us to think through these issues in this way. So first of all, it's important for us to separate sentimentality from science. It's easy to hear the story of the individual who feels like a woman trapped in a man's body, or someone who's always been tomboyish and been misunderstood. I understand that. Like I said, those are real issues. But that doesn't mean that transgender treatments are the solution to those problems. Those treatments can actually cause more issues down the road. We've got to look at the science. And what does the science say? The science says that if you follow those treatments, in the long run, they don't help. People are still killing themselves. They're in terrible shape, and they've now damaged their bodies permanently where they can't ever get that back. Experts, even though they're experts, can be wrong. Opioid experts, doctors, were wrong. And like body integrity identity disorder, gender identity disorders, psychological. So then why are people seeking a biological fix? I understand we live in the age where everybody wants to take a pill to feel better, right? We don't want to actually run on the treadmill and cut our calories. We want to undergo surgery. And then, hey, I've lost weight. I don't have to think about it anymore. Look, the science shows that transitioning will not be effective in overcoming people's feelings of depression and loss. And many people with gender identity disorder have other issues. They have other psychological issues. Look at Walt Heyer's story. He says, it was a psychologist that I was working alongside who first pulled me aside and said, you have dissociative identity disorder. I can tell there's something that's not clicking with you. Can you come in for counseling? And that's what started Walt. And he had alcoholism to try and escape it. So he had to deal with that. It was finally a pastor who accepted him as he was, even as Laura, who finally showed him how to escape the bonds of his childhood through the love of Christ. And it's a wonderful story. If you've never read it, you can go to Walt Heiser's website, sexchangeregret.com, and read it there. So we need to separate the sentimentality from the science, because there are sad stories, but there are sad stories on all sides. Secondly, we need to show the incongruence of the transgender position. What do I mean by that? I mean, it doesn't make sense. When you actually just stop and think about it, transgender, the concept of being a person born in the wrong body because your feelings tell you so, is illogical. Look, following our feelings shouldn't be the golden rule. And we know this even from those individuals who would champion transgender rights. Take the idea of randy college fraternity guys, right? Guys who just want to score and hook up with girls at college and all that thing. The Me Too movement is replete with women saying, this isn't right. I don't care if you feel like you need to do this. You are supposed to be above your feelings. You're not supposed to act out just because you feel that way. Well, I don't feel incomplete. No, it doesn't matter. You don't get to choose to be an idiot. You don't get to choose to, even if you're not necessarily directly physically engaging with a girl, the things you say, the way you look at them, things like that, those are all issues that we would say, I don't care what you're feeling. Curb your feelings. You're not an animal. You're a human being. Well, if that's true, then what do we do with the person who says, I'm feeling like a woman trapped in a man's body or a man trapped in a woman's body? We have a huge issue within the LGBTQ community where lesbians do not want to date transgender women who have undergone a sex change to become, or men who have undergone a sex change to become women. There's a huge issue within that itself. So the L's are fighting against the T's in that regard. Or let's just say something completely simple. Look, if I have an individual who's a kleptomaniac and they have this compulsion to steal, I can understand that. I can sympathize with that, but I won't throw open the doors of my store and say, grab whatever you want in order to make yourself feel well, right? So just because someone feels that way, that doesn't make sense. So you have to show that these things really don't make sense. They don't work in their own way. There is no such thing as gender. Gender is what French nouns have. And this is one of the things that I've done over and over. Why do we base our value or our identity on gender? How does this even make sense? What does gender get us that is of any benefit whatsoever? If you identify as female, what does that mean that you can do that you couldn't do as identifying as male? Are girls able to get better jobs than guys? Or if you're a girl, can you not say, get into mathematics? Do you have to identify as a male in order to be an astronaut? Do you have to identify as a male in order to not wear dresses? Do you have to identify as a female in order to be someone who's considered caring and loving? No. Those things are silly. Of course not. We would never say that you are forced to wear a dress because you're a girl. That makes no sense. Matter of fact, most of the feminist movement is built around the fact that women should be able to have equal opportunity in all aspects as men. So what does identifying then as a man get the woman? That something, what wasn't there before? This is why I really eschew the whole concept of gender. I don't talk about people as gendered. I don't ever ask, what gender are you? People are sexed. Like I said before, sex is biology. People are sexed. Gender is what French nouns have. And what bothers me, and what concerns me greatly, is that in our society, there's been a subtle shift by certain advocates to replace the word sex with gender. So now on identification forms and other things, you're not asked what's your sex, you're asked what's your gender. Now, that's a subtle thing, but it's a big thing because, like I said, gender is subjective. Why wouldn't we want to identify individuals by the sex that they are? Because that's something that identity is based on. Like fingerprints. Fingerprints identify you. Height identifies you. They're biological characteristics. Sex identifies you. It's a biological characteristic. People are not gendered. Gender is a construct of our physiology applied to, again, the norms of society. So, I think we need to show that there's just an incongruence in how these things work. Lastly, you have to know who you're talking to. And I think this is key as well. If the person you're talking with is struggling with their own gender identity, then the first thing you have to understand is you need to listen to them. You need to be loving, supportive. Again, they are a human being made in the image of God. And as a human being made in the image of God, then we need to treat them with the respect that they deserve in that regard. So therefore, we approach them that way. And in doing so, we elevate them. We don't degrade them, right? We don't give men special preference over women. Paul says that in 1 Corinthians, there is no male or female. There is no slave or free. There is no Jew or Greek. All are one in the body of Christ. We all bear the image of God and are all equally worthy of respect. It has nothing to do with whether we like to play with trucks or dolls. It has nothing to do with whether we like to wear pants or not. So an individual who's struggling with this, recognize that they are an individual and they do have a desire to feel whole again. And so we want to listen to them. Tell them you accept them as human beings, but we don't necessarily want to feed into their delusion. If a person is advocating for transgenderism as a movement, if this is not an individual who's, there's a third category, there's individuals who have a loved one who's undergoing this. We need to be sensitive there as well. But what we need to do is we need to ask them questions. Well, what is the outcome? Have you looked at long-term outcomes for individuals who've undergone, transitioning? How'd they do? Have you ever read any contrary evidence? Maybe there's a couple of stories that, I can share with you to show why these cases aren't necessarily as cut and dry as you think. The political point, though, we have to show them that what they're talking about is just nonsense. That saying that gender is a real thing, so I change my physical body because of the psychological state, really doesn't make any sense at all. Now, very quickly, before we'll go to our questions, what about pronouns? What do we do when someone asks you to use a specific pronoun? Well, like I said, I don't accept the idea of gender. I accept the idea of sex. And I would say that you want to use the pronoun of the sex of the individual that you're talking to. Walt Heyer's pastor when giving his testimony, said he wanted to encourage Walt, but not to continue to strengthen Walt's false beliefs that transitioning was right. And Walt said he was only able to heal once he admitted that his transitioning was wrong, was an error. That's a key piece. So when I start talking about pronouns, it makes me very uncomfortable to think that if I start using a pronoun that reflects something that's not true, if I call a female a he, then I'm actually damaging language, and I'm helping them feed their acceptance of what is actually sin. Look, there are many, many women who are anorexic. They look at themselves, they see themselves as fat, they see the imperfections, they see the flaws. We know that this is a very dangerous disease. I have sympathy for them. I have, concern. I won't call them fat just to agree with them and make them feel better, though. That would be wrong. As far as I'm concerned, that would be I would be complicit in actually helping them achieve a deeper level of crisis in so doing. So that's the issue with transgenderism. I think we need to be sensitive to it. I think we need to understand what it is. But I do think that our society is running amok. We're holding a massive experiment on the next generation of kids. 1,800 in 2010. That's just in the UK. Think about what's going on in the US and Canada and Australia and all these other Western, especially Western nations, where this is happening all the time. So what I'd like to do then is to open it up for questions. If you have a question, you can, like I said, type it into the live chat, or you can send me a text on Twitter, which I can check over here. I pull this up and see if there's any questions there. All you have to do is use the hashtag ComeReason, ComeReason, or you can send a text to 951-732-8631. And that's the other way you can get in touch with us. And I should be able to pick up one of these screens that I have going on here at some point. So is there anyone out there who would love to ask a question or anything like that? I'll just wait for a minute because I know that sometimes the system does delay for a half of a bit. I'd love to get a live call-in number for some of these things. I'm just not quite sure how I can do that yet. That would be the ultimate way to do so. If I guess we could do a Skype call, perhaps. If some of you have Skype, you'll have to let me know either in the comments or send me a text or something like that if you'd like to do Skype for some of these things, because I know there's got to be a lot of people who are just deeply concerned and confused about these kinds of issues. So okay, let me check one more time to make sure as we are streaming that it's all running. Unless I am missing something, I don't believe we have any questions today. Okay, well, like I said, one of the things that we're going to do is we will come back next time and deal with a whole bunch of things. First of all, you should know that next week, as I'll pull it out, we are having another topic. How could a loving God send people to hell? That is our topic for next week. So that should be quite a topic of discussion as well. I know that a lot of people have those kinds of questions. If you want to get in touch with me, you can email me if you have questions about this talk and you want to engage maybe via email. You can do that. Our website is there, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. All are able to be found very easily. Just kind of put ComeReason at the end of every one of them. And I hope you sign up. If you haven't signed up, again, yet make sure you do so in order to get, like I said, the notes for this study, where I'll have some of the statistics there, as well as the slides from the PowerPoint and all those kinds of things. And then you can look back at some of the past lessons as well, as I make those available to you. So, okay, thank you all so much. And until we see each other next time, God bless.